Hi there. In this lecture, I want to talk about ancient India and how some of the earliest images of Hindu gods and deities appeared. Some of the ways in which we find some of the earliest representations of spiritual beings in India are not the gods, but actually sort of lesser fertility figures called Yakshi or Yaksha. And these are deities or figures that are sort of local origin. They have a kind of spiritual connection to the region for which they were created. They are associated with a particular place and usually connected with wealth and fertility. They can be monstrous or have supernatural powers. Sometimes they ride on mythic creatures. This is the earliest example of the idea of the Vahana, the idea of something that a deity will ride on. As you can see here in the Shalabanjika, the Yakshi from Bharut, there is their animal at her feet. This idea of something that carries. Now, the way in which stone carvings appear in India is rather miraculous. There's really no evolution. We just sort of suddenly have these sculptures, and people have wondered how it was that sculpture, came into being, such sophistication so quickly. And it's possible that the earliest of these were based on ivory carvings that are now lost to us. Most of the statues, though, have a very distinct frontal orientation. Even though they're really carved in the round, or in part, most in the round, in a deep relief, they really still present to themselves in this way. They should be seen from the front. This is also true of a remarkably sophisticated early sculpture known as the Yakshi figure, the Chauri bearer. The Chauri is this fly whisk that the figure is holding. And like the other Yakshis, we see this kind of exaggeration of human anatomy, this idealization of the forms to represent a perfect body that has this kind of sense of vitality and abundance. This particular figure has a remarkable history. It was discovered quite by accident as a river bank had eroded and it appeared in the sand, and the local villagers took it home and worshipped it as a goddess. Only at the time, the British overseers of the region saw it for what it actually was, which is a Yakshi, not actually a goddess, but the servant to a deity. Yakshi are not exactly deities in that sense, that they are spiritual beings, sort of like angels or devils in some cases, that are sort of attendants to the deities. And thus the fly whisk there sort of is a symbol of that sort of servitude status that these beings have toward the actual gods. The fly whisk is still used in wedding ceremonies. One of the things that's really interesting about Hindu statues is there's a sense of motion or movement in the figures. Even this figure, which looks relatively static to us, one foot is slightly ahead of the other, and there's sort of a slight bend in the left leg that allows the statue sort of a graceful motion, which has been described as the gait of a swan, or Malagrimini. This is once thought to be a Mauryan empire creation from about 321 to 184 BCE, but now seems to have been several hundred years later in a region that maintained the tradition of stone carving that was from that earlier period, when many others had sort of already converted to a newer style. One of the earliest depictions we have of a major deity is Shiva. Shiva, who is this very important and popular deity of creation and destruction, is closely associated with the idea of the linga, or phallus. This is the male erect penis. You can see that the figure here, the Parashirameshvara statue, is one where we have this figure superimposed on a penis standing on a demon. And this is representation, of course, is part of the common iconography for Shiva. Older representations of Shiva are quite simply a kind of an erect stone with no actual anatomical representation at all. It is, as we see here on the right, the idea of the linga, the erect pillar encased in the yoni, the vaginal the yoni, the yoni, or female sex organ. The demon that Shiva is standing on is known as Apasmara, and he is a person who clings to things and resists change, because ultimately Shiva is all about change and transformation and creation and destruction. So Apasmara suffers for his attachment to things. So Shiva is there to remind us that to accept his movement, his motion. Which reminds me of the other very important way in which Shiva is commonly known as the god of dance. This is a later representation of Shiva from the Chola dynasty, but if you've ever seen any representation of Shiva, it was very likely this Shiva Nataraja. I'm showing you here three slightly different varieties of this statue to give you some idea of the immense popularity of this design, but also just the subtle variations. The ring that surrounds Shiva is either a perfect circle, or it could be, like on the left, more like a womb, or more on the right, an egg. All of these symbolize the idea of creation and procreation, and that Shiva, the dancing figure, is sort of quickening or enlivening that space. And you see the streaming out from his head is his wild hair, his dreadlocks of sorts, sort of tangled and matted hair, kind of flying outward, touching into and connecting with the cosmos. Chola dynasty bronzes are quite remarkable for their sophistication, and this is certainly one of the more challenging figures to make, with its limbs supporting and moving in so many different directions, and yet seems so perfectly balanced and harmonious. Another way we often see Shiva is in this kind of dual role as male and female. And this is Ardhanarishvara, the Lord as a woman. Now, make no mistake, Shiva is male and is closely connected to the male linga. In this case here, what he is merely revealing is that he also has within him this capacity of the female, and that he is revealing that part. This figure here is both sort of cut down the middle, a feminine side and a masculine side. And that idea of that sort of dual identity is that it represents his power, just like Hindu deities that are sporting more than two arms, their ability to be in multiple places at once. Thus, this sort of combination of genders is a way of being or expressing the ability of having both of them in that capacity. This is a lovely sculpture that depicts a number of other important features of Hindu iconography, notably the hierarchic scale, where you have these smaller figures who are there as devotees, showing their attention to Shiva, and Shiva sort of towering over them in relationship to them, that we are supposed to see ourselves as a devotee in the relationship to Shiva. We also see the Vahana for Shiva, Nandi, the bull. The other major deity that I want to talk about early on is Vishnu. Vishnu is the preserver god, the second of the Brahman Trimurti, and the one who's there to kind of hold the universe together. Is often depicted by two important symbols, the conch or shankha, which is a symbol of sound and the power of that sort of commanding the sound, and Vishnu is the god of sound. And the chakra, which is a weapon that Shiva gave him when he was faced to try and destroy some powerful demon and restore order to the universe. He was in need of a weapon of Shiva's. Thus the chakra is now a symbol of Vishnu. So Vishnu's role is really to kind of hold things together. And if something in the universe is throwing it out of balance, he is there to eliminate that and bring the world back into balance. Here is an early temple, one of the earliest temples we have to Vishnu. It's the Jashavatara temple in Deogath and Gupta period. Now, Hindu statues and temples are much older. The surviving ones are much older than when we start looking at Buddhist art, which will have already been around for hundreds of years at this time. The Gupta period is sort of the full flowering of what we now know as sort of Buddhist iconography. So it's interesting to think about when we look at Hindu art and sculpture, why was it so late in coming into being? And it sort of appears in its fullest fruition. So there's a kind of crossover between ideas of Buddhism and ideas of Hinduism in the way in which the figure is represented. Here's what this temple would have looked like at the time of its building. And you'll see it's a fairly simple design. There's a sort of a building in the center on a platform with space around it where people can move freely around this. And there's also a series of 4 smaller temples on the 4 corners. So this idea of way people would worship this temple was they would first go to the lower perimeter, walk around clockwise, and then they would go up the stairs and they would travel again clockwise around the temple, saying their prayers, and then finally arriving at the central opening where they would make their offering. Now this kind of design has been described as kind of a mountain cave, and it may have been that the earliest Hindu shrines were just that, caves in mountains that are now completely lost to us. But this idea of this representation of a mountain and an opening in that mountain where the deity resides, this is an important feature in the Hindu temples. Off to the side of the opening, we have one of the oldest and really remarkable relief carvings of Vishnu. This we see Vishnu reclining. He is in repose. The universe has been destroyed, and it is his job to hold on to the memory of the universe's past. And thus, out of his meditation, we see this lotus blossom emerge, and directly above him is Brahma, the god of creation, who will then be born out of Vishnu's dream, and he will then meditate, and it's his job then to bring the universe back into creation. Watching from the sidelines here, we see Shiva, who's always on hand to start things rolling again and get things back into flux. In the foreground, we have an interesting configuration of 6 figures, 5 male and 1 female. The 5 male figures are the Pandava, and the 6th one is Draupadi, their single wife. This is stories of the Mahabharata, which is an important story about the deity Vishnu coming to earth as Krishna, and these heroes in the foreground are the ones who heed Krishna's advice and do his bidding to restore the universe to power. So this is a very important way in which these heroes are in fact the sort of guardians of Vishnu. They're the defenders of this idea and the restorers of the universe to order. Aside from a lot of male gods, there is a whole class of female deities concerning the idea of Shakti, which is the female power. We'll talk more about this. The Shakti is itself a source of energy in the world, which creates and produces all kinds of important ideas about energy and power and change. Parvati, you see here, is the wife of Shiva. And she also, in this sort of fertility figure, she also has another aspect where it represents Durga, the destroying, the one who represents death and decay. So when we look at Hindu deities as deities, we understand that they had a very important role for practicing Hindus, the way of promoting their own devotion. They were an opportunity for people to sort of visualize the deity that they were worshiping, and that this deity was not actually the god itself, but a kind of conduit, that the deity may inhabit this when needed to receive the offerings and prayers of the devotee. So it's sort of understood the sculpture is not exactly the deity, but that the sculpture is, again, some part of the deity, some aspect or manner of the deity that is being embodied so the worshiper can access them. So the very valuable thing here for this is the people who paid to have these sculptures made. And patronage is a very important part of this art making process. And indeed, a lot of what we know about the art of this time is not even the artists who made it, but the patrons who paid for the artists who made it. And they were supposed to gain merit or have some kind of status, special status bestowed upon them, some god's favor for making these works of art possible. There's also a sense in which the art is there to grant protection, that people go to pray and make offerings with the hope the gods will provide some sort of guidance or better still, some kind of protection from the dangers of the world. Demons were also made offerings to, but they were also sort of dealt with as a part of Hindu philosophy and religion by sort of reasoning with them, giving them offerings, and even using violence and sort of beating back demons. So contending with evil is a really interesting component of Hindu faith. The Natya Sastra is a very important textbook when we understand the art of India. Even though it is a book about theater, ostensibly, the aesthetic ideas and the underlying sentiments and goals of Sanskrit drama are very closely aligned to the visual arts. Drama and theater is a much older art than the visual arts, and it's one that continues to play a very important role in influencing how people perceive the visual arts. Sanskrit drama was sort of created sometime between the 4th century and thrived up until the 10th century CE or AD. The book, the Natya Sastra, attributes the creation of drama to a man by the name of Bharata Muni. Now, it's clear from the text, though, that really many people were involved in the creation of theater, and there are many, many different kinds of theater that the textbook describes. And Bharata Muni is a kind of mythical origin story with a lot of really sort of fantastic elements, such that Bharata Muni is said to have had 100 sons who were all his original actors. Bharata Muni is said to have claimed that he has created the Fifth Veda, and that it is a kind of spiritual teaching up there alongside the 4 earlier Vedas of ancient Indian heritage. It's not actually a Fifth Veda. There's no such thing as a Fifth Veda. Theater, though, does play a very important role in sort of drawing together and unifying a lot of ideas that are contained in the Vedas, such that it says there is no wise maxim, no learning, no art or craft, no device, no action that is not found in drama. And this idea that the theater world is somehow a kind of mirror of the real world, and it's a mirror not just for the people who are watching it, most especially it's a mirror of humanity for the gods. Today, Kathakali is perhaps one of the most popular forms of theater derived from the Natya Sastra. As I said, the actual Sanskrit drama that the Natya Sastra attempts to describe disappeared 1,000 years ago. But many new forms of theater have emerged since then and have carried on the traditions of theater craft inspired by what was found in the Natya Sastra. So in the Natya Sastra, we have this really interesting idea about emotions, and that emotions play one of the pivotal roles in understanding Hindu art. That people go to look at art and theater to feel these emotions, these rasa. And rasa really means the essence of something. As I mentioned earlier, essences are really important, and thus emotions, rasa, are very important to art and theater. The essence of the thing is the feeling it gives you, and that is what we go to experience. And the Natya Sastra finds 8 essential rasa. Now this chart here shows 9. The 9th rasa is not actually one of the originals 8s. It's that sort of shanta, quiescent one at the sort of lower right corner there, which is sort of the absence of all emotion. That's an idea that emerged much later in the history of theater. But the dramatic theory is that rasa is the thing the audience feels. And what this actor is demonstrating to us here with all these facial expressions is actually the bhava. So if we see, such as the face for disgust, we recognize that as disgust, and we feel disgust by seeing that reaction to disgust. So the bhava is the thing that the actor does, and then we get the feeling of rasa from the bhava. And it's a really interesting way in which we understand these things, and the way they explain them. So like if you imagine if we were to drink a bottle of wine, the flavor is not in the wine essentially, it's in the person drinking the wine. That I understand and experience the drinking because I have a sensitivity to it. It's not that it has these things for everyone all the same, such that I, who know very little about wine, will taste certain things about wine, but if a wine expert, a sommelier, is drinking wine, they're going to taste something completely different, much richer, much more nuanced, and they can talk about this. So that the rasa that someone experiences is really dependent on who they are. So, to recap here, let's talk some about the essential ideas about Hindu art. First is the idea of idealized forms, that the human body, though it looks very physical and very real, is idealized. It's simplified and essentialized into these sort of abstract forms. It's based not on what an actual individual looks like, but on these sort of perfect bodies that represent yogic unity of the spirit and the body. And one of the ways they accomplish this is through this sort of deep navel. We see a lot of these sort of full round bellies with these deep navels. This is prana, this is the breath, the yogic breath that centers the spirit in the body. And as we've seen, there's a lot of dancing going on, whether it's Shiva Nataraja. These are dances that are described in detail in the Natya Sastra, and that these dance gestures, these angika, are the ways in which people read and understand what this statue is expressing. And that there's this very essential idea of emotion, that the essence of the thing that we're experiencing when we come in encounter a deity as a statue is the feeling that it gives off. That's all for today.